When I think of great, agile heavyweights in wrestling history, I think of names like The Undertaker and Kane, Big Show in his younger years in WCW. Andre the Giant was a wreck by the time I started watching wrestling, but having seen clips of young Andre, he was quite great. Bam Bam Bigelow was out there doing cartwheels in the ring. Even a guy like Yokozuna, he was very agile for a man of his size. But in terms of not just his agility and doing things like moonsaults off the top rope, but just in terms of overall badassery, for my money, the greatest super heavyweight of all time, however you want to define that, 330 and up, let's say, is Big Van Vader. His matches in WCW with Sting and Cactus Jack and Ric Flair in the early 90s, they were awesome. A top guy everywhere he went except WWE, where he was never really a true top guy because by that point he was too beat up, and there were guys who just didn't like working with him. But he was a top guy everywhere else, across multiple continents. Vader is one of the all-time greats. And he was the subject of this week's Dark Side of the Ring, which was a strong episode that didn't cover a lot of new ground if you're already familiar with the man's career, but it did a good job of covering all the important stuff while adding insights from his ex-wife and his son, the people that knew him best. And it paints a picture of a man who just did not know when or how to turn off the Vader persona and just be Leon White. His son Jesse offered a lot of good insight here. His son used to wrestle for WWE. He was part of Florida Championship Wrestling. He was under the name Jake Carter. And he even won the FCW tag team titles with Corey Graves. And then he wrestled a little bit in the early days of NXT after they rebranded. But his career hit the skids at that point, and he didn't wrestle much after he was released. He talked about his dad growing up around a lot of violence at home caused by alcohol. His ex-wife, Deborah, said that he would get into fights almost every day at school. He got drafted by the Rams in the third round of the NFL draft, but I cannot find any evidence of him actually playing in a regular season or postseason game. That Rams team in '79 played in the Super Bowl. And even though he didn't, he was still technically part of a team that won the NFC Championship and played in the Super Bowl. But he spent all of his time on injured reserve. He was plagued by knee injuries that ended his football career. And that paved the way for him to start wrestling. And when you realize that he learned early in his career from Bruiser Brody and Stan Hansen, it's not really that hard to, understand why he worked as stiff as he did. He took a lot of punishment from those two. He never bitched about it. He just figured, well, that's the way it's supposed to be. That's how wrestling works. So he ends up in Japan. And this is where Big Van Vader is born. One of the greatest gimmicks of all time. And he wasn't even the first choice for it. They didn't get into this. They really didn't get heavy into the details at all here with some of this stuff. So I will. Because it is really one of the great debuts of all time. And it made Vader's career in one night. So it was at a New Japan event at Sumo Hall. Antonio Inoki was looking to bring in a new monster heel character and had become familiar with a famous manga artist who went on to create the Jushin Thunder Liger character a couple of years later. Vader was a character out of Japanese folklore, and this guy did the concept art for it with the samurai headgear, and there are sketches of the character looking really ripped and jacked, which Vader was not. But that's why Jim Hellwig was the original choice for the gimmick. Hellwig was working in World Class at the time when he got the call to go work for WWE. Had he not gotten that call when he did, he was headed to Japan, and there would be no Ultimate Warrior. Sid Vicious was the other choice for the role, but ultimately Inoki chose Leon White. And so on this night, Inoki was scheduled to wrestle Riki Choshu. And Inoki was the man. Rarely did he lose back then, certainly not clean. It was years since he lost a match. So the match lasts all of 6 minutes, and another wrestler runs in, saves Riki Choshu, who was locked in a submission hold. He refused to give up. So the fans got a cheap DQ finish, and they were not happy about it. And throwing garbage at the ring and all this stuff. When all of a sudden, down to the ring comes Vader in his giant headgear, making his debut. And the challenge is issued to Inoki, and they have an impromptu match, which lasts no more than 2 or 3 minutes. And Vader beats him. Not only does he beat Inoki, he squashes him clean in the middle. It would be like Brock Lesnar squashing John Cena at SummerSlam, only if that was Brock's debut. The problem is the fans are still angry about the lame main event that they paid to see, and it caused a riot. And it took police an hour to get things under control. And New Japan was banned from running Sumo Hall again for years. Like they didn't run that building again for at least another 2 years. Vader would go on to become the first American to win the IWGP Championship. And then they covered the legendary match between Vader and Stan Hansen, one of the men who helped break him into the business. Now, you've heard about the match in Germany that he had with Cactus Jack where Foley lost an ear. Well, here in Japan, Vader got hit so hard by Hansen, and it actually may have been a thumb to the eye, his eyeball popped out of its socket. Vader pulls his mask off and is literally trying to push his eye back into his skull. Like, it is so nasty. It's not the first time I've seen this. This is a famous match. But every time I see it, I just cringe. It's just so fucking gross. And he continued the match, which only added to the man's aura. You hear that word thrown around today. All the kids love to use it. This guy's got aura. She's got aura. You don't have real aura until you've had your fucking eyeball knocked out of your head and you have to push it back in like it's nothing. That's aura. And that was the match that led to WCW making an offer to bring him in. He was still allowed to work New Japan dates. It wasn't an exclusive deal. And actually, he spent most of his time there still. In the episode, his wife says he was spending 32 weeks a year there. So you can imagine his son says that his father missed a lot of things because he just wasn't around. But in WCW, they put Harley Race with him as his manager, and he became WCW World Champion. You know, his matches with Sting are some of the best in that company's history. The King of Cable tournament final, the White Castle of Fear strap match. Those are some of the best WCW matches of all time. But he was tough to work with. He hurt people. I'm not talking Bobby Lashley and Shelton Benjamin on Dynamite coming out to, we hurt people. Like, he really hurt people. He broke Sting's ribs during their program together. He injured Nikita Koloff. And he didn't end his career so much as Koloff just decided after that he was done in the business, because they said in the episode and online that Vader ended his career. He didn't retire because of Vader. He could have come back if he wanted to. He just chose not to. And he had his Lloyd's of London insurance policy like a lot of wrestlers did back then, including a lot of guys who abused their policies. And that's why Lloyd's of London no longer insures pro wrestlers. Mick Foley was another one. I mean, my God, the abuse that Foley took in the ring with Vader is insane. But then there's the infamous story of Joe Thurman, who was an enhancement talent that got his back broken and his career ended by Vader. They actually found Thurman and they interviewed him for the episode. He said he's never talked about this to anybody before. He was only 20 years old and he was working his very first match for WCW. And Vader walks up to him in the back before the match and says, "Hey, we're working together and it's going to be quick." And he asked Thurman if he's good taking the powerbomb. And Thurman says, "Yes, no problem." And that was that. He didn't think anything of it. They show the match because it was very quick. And it was a handicap match, which is quite fitting given that he soon would become handicapped himself. Whatever happened, something set Vader off. Or it was just a case of he just got in the zone. And some people, when they get in that zone, they just become a different person. Because according to Thurman, he turned into a completely different person once the bell rang and the match started. And it sounds like he just got too up his own ass about living the gimmick and being the monster the WCW wanted him to be. Because after being nice to him in the back, he says Vader tells him, and again, the fans can't hear this, when they're communicating in the ring. And if you watch the footage, you don't really see it or hear it anywhere. But Vader in the ring says to him, "You better jump, you motherfucker," which led to a brutal chokeslam spot that folded Thurman up. That looked bad enough. Then Vader says, "Come here, you little piece of shit." And then comes the powerbomb that changed the rest of this man's life. It was reckless. It was careless. And it was completely unnecessary the way he slammed that man to the mat. The force of it. It broke Thurman's back in two places. He says he remembers feeling numb. He told the referee, "I can't feel my legs." He was temporarily paralyzed. The impact was so severe. Think of how hard he had to powerbomb this guy. The impact was so severe, he says it almost severed his spinal cord. And in his first book, Mick Foley wrote that Vader was in tears in the back after, what had happened, and Vader went to go visit Thurman in the hospital that night, which Thurman confirmed in the episode. And Vader asks him as, he walks in, he goes, "Hey, buddy, are you okay?" And Thurman says he just absolutely unloaded on him. He just called him every name under the sun. He really let him have it, and Vader just cried. But he didn't give a shit. Yeah, Thurman did not give a shit because the doctors are telling this 20-year-old kid that you're never going to wrestle again. All right? This is the biggest match of his life, and he just had his dream taken away from him because this man failed to do the one thing that you are supposed to do when you are in the ring, which is protect your opponent. Make sure they leave the ring in one piece the way they walked into it. He had every right to be upset. Vader was an asshole, plain and simple. In this instance, Vader was an asshole. Thurman, by the way, he did go on to make a full recovery, even though he never wrestled again. He did go on to work as a police officer, and then he was an actor. And I didn't realize it at the time I was watching it, but Ozark is one of my favorite shows with Jason Bateman, and Thurman actually had a part on the show. He played a Kansas City mob guy for one episode. But outside of the matches with Sting and Foley, one of his best matches came at Starrcade in 1993. That's where he lost the WCW World title to Ric Flair, who was the backup. The original plan was to build Sid Vicious as the world champion. He would beat Vader for the belt, but then Sid and Arn Anderson, they almost killed each other in that famous hotel story in England. Sid ended up getting fired. So they went back to their tried and true. They went back to Ric Flair, and they had a great match with Flair putting his career on the line. As great of a heel as Flair was, he was a great babyface here. But of course, 6 months later, when Hulk Hogan came to WCW, it was time for Flair to turn back heel because Hogan needed someone to beat. And Hogan coming in didn't work out well for Vader either. Hogan's in-ring style, it's almost comical when you compare the two. Hogan's in-ring style and Vader's in-ring style. It's like oil and water. They just didn't go together. No way was Hogan going to allow Vader to work him over the way he did everybody else, which meant that if they did work together, Vader was going to have to come down to his level. He was going to have to change his style, and it just made him look very weak. Even his son says the matches with Hogan were a watered-down version of Vader. And I'll tell you what, I cannot say that Hogan was wrong here. WCW invested a lot in him to come in and carry the company, and putting your top draw in the ring with Vader so that Vader could stiff the shit out of him probably would not have been a good idea. I don't think I would have wanted that either if I was the promoter. But they did have a feud, and it was completely ridiculous. They showed the clip of Vader giving him a powerbomb. I think it was on one of the Clash of the Champions shows. It wasn't in a match. But Hogan immediately pops right back up and no-sells it. And Vader says, he was double-crossed. Because they had shoot interview audio spliced into the episode of interviews that Vader has done over the years. And Vader says he was double-crossed because Hogan was supposed to lay there and not get up. If you watch it, though, the way Vader turns his back to go pose for the crowd after the powerbomb, it looks like it was set up for Hogan to get up the way he did. I'm just saying. But either way, it was ridiculous. Vader did get a measure of revenge, I guess you would say, by kicking out of the leg drop at 1 in their first match. That was the match at Super Brawl in 95. It's been a long time since I've seen that match. It may have been a decent match. I just remember what a shit finish it had. But it wasn't anywhere near as bad as their strap match at Uncensored. That would have been fun for them to cover on this episode. It was Hogan against Vader, with the idea that you have to drag your opponent to each corner of the ring and touch all 4 turnbuckles to be declared the winner. This aired on pay-per-view. The WCW title on this pay-per-view was not on the line. And why it wasn't on the line would become clear with the finish of this match because of the egos involved. It just wasn't possible for the title to be on the line. And imagine in a non-title match like this, still not being able to have a clean finish and giving the fans what they gave them here. Of course, leave it to Ric Flair to be the punching bag for everybody, which was basically his job. Once Hogan was brought into the company, that's what his role was. He was used to do jobs all the time for him, and he was made to look like a complete blithering idiot. So you had Flair out there during this match. You had the Renegade out there, who was their Wish version of the Ultimate Warrior, beating up Flair, no-selling whatever Flair would do to him. And oh, did I mention that Flair came out earlier in the show dressed as a woman to attack the Macho Man? So when he came back out here for this match, he still had eyeliner on and his nails were painted as if this wasn't bad enough. And then for the finish, Hogan put the strap on Flair and dragged Flair to all four corners of the ring to win the match, even though Flair was not even part of the actual match. That kind of sums up the Hogan-Vader feud in a nutshell. He didn't last much longer after that. They mentioned the backstage incident with Vader and Paul Orndorff that led to Vader being fired. Orndorff was retired by that point. He was an agent for them behind the scenes. And he was a tough guy, you know? I mean, so was Vader, but Orndorff was tough too. He was a street fighter before he ever got into wrestling. And it was backstage at a WCW TV taping. Vader had shown up late. And there are conflicting versions about what happened here, but Vader showed up late. And as far as who was at fault and all that, again, you'll get different versions of this, but words were exchanged. Orndorff told him he had interviews to do, and I guess Vader wasn't moving fast enough for him, so he told him to get his fat ass moving. Vader slapped him. They fought. Vader claims he front face locked him and took him down to the ground. Bullet Bob Armstrong saw the whole thing and said that Orndorff just beat him until Vader started bleeding. Dave Penzer, the ring announcer at the time, has said that it had nothing to do with Vader being late or anything like that. He said Orndorff's description of the fight is the most accurate version. And what we do know is that Orndorff started kicking Vader in the face while he was on the ground with his flip-flops on. This badass Street Fighter dude is kicking the shit out of this giant man with flip-flops on. So someone had to take the fall for what happened, and Vader was the fall guy. And in the episode, Mick Foley said that Vader was never the same after he lost that fight to Orndorff. But it did lead to him finally making the jump months later to WWE. And you would think, you know, you have an instant top heel in this man. Like, imagine the things Vince McMahon could do with a heavyweight like Vader on top, right? You can imagine it because that's about the only place it happened was in your head. I remember Vader's debut very vividly. Throwing guys out of the Royal Rumble, beating up Gorilla Monsoon on Raw the next night, which was a big deal at the time. Like, you didn't put your hands on Gorilla Monsoon. And they did it, though, to cover up for an injury that he had. He had just debuted, and he was already hurt. He came in with a shoulder injury. He needed time off for shoulder surgery. So that's why they shot the angle in the storyline that, you know, they were suspending him for the attack on Monsoon. They did it to get him off TV so that he could heal up. But that angle was so great. Like, if you were to book Vader as this monster top heel, that's exactly the way you would book him from the start. And unfortunately, it was all downhill from there. It was a combination of Vince McMahon losing faith in him and not knowing what Vader was, because he didn't watch any wrestling outside of his own, you know, and Cornette said the same thing here in the episode. And Vader's own health issues, that was the other thing that held him back. It didn't help that he got fatter. Right, he got a lot heavier. He allowed his weight to get out of control. Jim Cornette's talked in the past about them putting a weight clause in his contract because his weight had ballooned up to something like 430 pounds, and they wanted him around 380. And he was pissed. You know, he pissed and moaned about them putting a weight clause in his contract, but this is the sort of thing they felt they had to do. In the episode, they mentioned that they sent Vader and Yokozuna to the Duke weight loss clinic at one point, and they actually gained weight because they were smuggling fried chicken into the dorm. Jim Ross has talked about that before. And when you're as beat up as Vader, and you're working the style that he worked for so many years, doing moonsaults off the top rope and working matches in Japan against people like Stan Hansen, you get older, you get heavier, and that's not a good combination. This was not prime Vader. Vince McMahon could have done more with him, absolutely. But let's not kid ourselves here. This was not prime Vader that Vince got in 1996. The blame for his failed run goes both ways. He did get to work a program with Shawn Michaels. You know, Shawn didn't like working with him because he was stiff. He wasn't used to working with people like that. And they showed the clip from their SummerSlam match where Shawn came off the top rope. Vader was supposed to roll out of the way. He didn't. So Shawn lands on his feet, and then he stomps Vader's head as hard as he possibly could. And he looks down at him, and he just yells, "Move!" Like a complete dick. And Shawn threatened once to get him fired if he kept working stiff with him. And Vader could have pounded him into the sand if he wanted to, but he just rolled out of the ring and just started crying. And Cornette was managing him at the time, and he said the same thing. He was in tears. You know, he was being bullied by Shawn Michaels because he knew how much influence Shawn had, and that if he wanted to, he could cost him his job. Plus, Shawn and other wrestlers, I mean, we can't ignore this either. Shawn Michaels and other wrestlers in the company, they did not want to work with him because of how bad his body odor was. And he would never wash his gear. So that was another strike against him. And it's like, dude, like, wash your fucking gear. I mean, that's disgusting. I don't blame the other wrestlers for complaining about that. Imagine coming to work and your job is to, roll around with these guys. They're already sweaty and gross. And now you've got this 400-pound guy who can't even wash his tights. I wouldn't want to work with him either. Bret Hart talked about that. Vader is actually one of the reasons that Bret Hart agreed to turn heel in 1997. We might never have gotten that great heel run, US versus Canada, from Bret Hart that year were it not for Vader. Bret really did not want to turn heel. And Vince McMahon tried to talk him into it. And so what he did was he wrote down a list. He presented him with two lists. One with the names of the guys that he would be working with if he stayed a babyface. And then one with a list of the people he would be working with if he went heel. And the heel list had people like Undertaker and Shawn Michaels and Stone Cold Steve Austin. Right? Pretty good list. And the list of heels for him to work with as a babyface had Vader at the very top. And as soon as he saw that, he decided, okay, maybe turning heel isn't such a bad idea. And he cited that as the main reason, Vader did not wash his gear. Or at least, I won't say he never washed it, but like he didn't wash it that much. And he just couldn't stand working with him. It was bad enough that he had those heavy hands. So he worked stiff. Now you throw that in on top of it. And look, I'm not a wrestler, okay? But wrestlers, they talk about this sometimes in interviews, like some shoot interviews. They'll talk about like which guys smelled the worst and which guys, they didn't want to work with and didn't wash their gear. It could be tough to always wash your gear on the road, especially as often as those guys were on the road back in the day. But what Bret, I think it was Bret who said this, like guys would hang their shit up on light poles in their hotel room or somewhere near the hot lights so that they would dry off by the time they woke up the next morning. Like there are hacks and ways to like figure out what to do to make sure your stuff is dry and it isn't still dripping wet by the time you put them back on the next night. But Vader didn't do that. And so Bret was like, you know what? I think that list of baby faces, I think I like that list better. But the original plan was actually for Vader to beat Shawn Michaels in Madison Square Garden at Survivor Series. And he was going to win the championship. But once Vince lost faith in him, they switched to Sid. That run that Sid got was earmarked originally for Vader. But Shawn Michaels did his best to make sure that got changed. And outside of a match here and there that ended Vader's run in the main event, that was it. Yeah, they did include him in that Final Four match in 97 when the title was vacant after Shawn lost his smile. And that was a great fucking match. Vader got busted open hard way, like not even 5 minutes in. And he just bled a gusher for the next 25 minutes. He's trying to wipe the blood out of his eyes. I remember I'm watching that match. Actually, they uploaded it to the Vault channel on YouTube in the last, month and a half. And I was watching that match and I'm like, God, just take the mask off, man. Like he's struggling so much. And I'm just like, take the mask off. And then finally he pulls the fucking mask off and then he got eliminated. So like he was in the ring for like almost half an hour. And in like minute 28, he finally pulls the mask off. I'm like, what? Why did you just pull it off earlier? Like it looked like he was completely miserable in there, but it was one hell of a match. And it was one hell of a performance in that match. But that was it. He never saw another pay-per-view main event ever again. They talked about Vader being held hostage in Kuwait while on a WWE tour there in 1997. Here's the story of how that all went down. Vader and The Undertaker, they appeared on a morning TV show called Good Morning Kuwait. And the host asks The Undertaker first, Okay, they didn't show any of this on the episode, but what happened is the host asked The Undertaker, in so many words, if what they did was fake. And Undertaker was very diplomatic in his answer. Vader, not so much. Now, Vader has claimed that the producer of the show was friends with the interviewer, and so he asked Vader to really ham it up after he asked the question, because he must have known the question was coming. And he tells Vader, this is what Vader says, that the producer told him, you just toss some furniture, grab the guy by his tie, like all the things that Vader ended up doing. Vader even dropped an F-bomb live on the air. But he claims the producer never bothered to tell the host about that plan, and the guy was scared to death, as anybody would be. So he thought maybe the producer was playing a prank on the guy, he was ribbing him. But Vader wasn't really that angry. He was only doing what he was told to do. He said Dave Hebner was standing right there off camera when the producer told him what he wanted him to do. So he went on to wrestle The Undertaker that night, and then the next day, the host decided to press charges against him. So Vader had to find himself a lawyer. The problem is, the next day was the start of a 2-week religious holiday. So the courts were closed, which meant that he was going to have to wait it out, even though the rest of the crew had already left. They got back on the plane to fly home. They left him there in Kuwait all by himself. In a foreign country, criminal charges pending against him, no less. I know some people think that he was thrown in jail. He was never thrown in jail. He was detained under house arrest for 2 weeks in a $600 a night resort. He said he even got a tan while he was there. But WWE, they aired these Vader held hostage in Kuwait updates on TV to get some publicity out of it. Gerald Briscoe told a story a few years ago. It might have been on the podcast that he does with JBL. But he told this story, which is just unbelievable, that U.S. Special Forces in Kuwait offered to smuggle Vader out of the country before his court appearance. They were going to hide him in a cargo container to France, and then from France have him take a commercial flight back to the U.S. Just the visual of them smuggling a 400-pound man out of there in secret and hiding him anywhere. I would imagine it was hard for Vader to hide. It's just hilarious to me. And Briscoe decided that it wasn't going to be worth the risk if they got caught, so they didn't do it. I think in the end they paid, what did he pay? He paid like a $120 fine, and he was allowed to leave. Like, I've paid more for a parking ticket than he did to get out of the country. But the talk show host actually refused to drop the charges. He lost his job over it. Then he sued WWE for $1 million for showing the footage on TV because he claimed it caused him great shame. I have no idea how or if that suit was ever settled, but the whole thing, it does make for a great story. They didn't mention any of that stuff. What they also didn't mention is that there were plans to put the Intercontinental title on Vader before this incident happened. And obviously it never happened. He never won any titles in WWE. But that incident happened in April of 97. Vader was stranded there for, 2 weeks? Owen Hart beat Rocky Maivia to win the Intercontinental title later that month. So it likely would have been Vader beating Rock instead of Owen to win that title if the timeline matches up. But the injuries started to pile up. Like so many other wrestlers, he got hooked on pain pills. The night that Vader lost to Kane and then called himself a big fat piece of shit after the match, Cornette says that's how Vince McMahon really thought of him, which is why he told him to say it. And once he did that, he was finished. A few months later, he was gone. And the funny thing is, he actually went on to have this great run in Japan after he left WWE, which they completely glossed over here. They had Jericho. I think they came back from commercial, and Jericho is the narrator. And Jericho called it like after a brief resurgence in Japan. Like, it was more than just a brief resurgence. He basically undid all the damage done to his rep working for Vince. Like, he won the All Japan Triple Crown twice. He was a tag team champion with Dr. Death. He was working matches, big matches against Misawa and Kobashi. Like, he had a career renaissance in Japan. He was like the comeback kid in 1999. But his bad habits were getting worse. He would spend days in bed drinking. His wife divorced him in 2007. He came home one day, found that she was just gone. He had both knees replaced, but he got an infection and he was bedridden for 6 months. He was also a diabetic, which his family did not know. And on a trip to Japan for an autograph signing, he fell unconscious on the plane, and he slipped into a diabetic coma for over a month. 33 days he laid there in Japan in a coma. When he woke up, he had lost 112 pounds. And then years later, he actually had a match with Will Ospreay in Rev Pro that got a lot of attention online because it wasn't mentioned here. And I wish they would have mentioned it, but it makes sense. I didn't think it would be because they only have so much time. It's not really relevant to the overall story they were telling. But that was really the last match of any note that he ever had in his career. And it was born out of him criticizing a famous match that Ospreay had with Ricochet in the Best of the Super Juniors in Japan, the video game match, as some people call it. Vader said that it wasn't wrestling. He said it was acrobatics. There's no story. It's just two high school gymnasts putting on a show. And a lot of people would agree with him. A lot would disagree with him. That's what made it so polarizing at the time. Rev Pro decided to turn it into an angle, make some money out of it. And they booked the match in London. And it was a spectacle because of just how much of a mismatch it was. Here you have Will Ospreay, who at this point was in his early 20s. Even then, one of the great high flyers in the world, but a relatively small guy, I would say, stepping into the ring against a 60-year-old super heavyweight, known for crippling people in his career. And that's a whole story in itself, that match, because Vader was supposed to put Ospreay over, but when he got there, he refused. And Ospreay put him over just to make sure he would just still do the match. He didn't want to fuck over Rev Pro. But he has since said that he fucking, in his words, fucking hates the match. And it was a horrible experience with a horrible dude. A few months later, though, was when he got the bad news that he was diagnosed with congestive heart failure. And he had 2 years left to live. This is what he tweeted, actually, on November 15th of that year. Told by 2 heart doctors that my heart is wore out. I have been given less than 2 years to live. I am only now allowing this as part of my reality. And he later said that he regretted tweeting about it. I assume because it hurt his bookings. I mean, look, what promoter is going to want to run the risk of using somebody who admitted that he's got a bad heart and he's going to be dead in 2 years? You know, he did a handful of matches after that, but not many. But he was just very angry. He was very angry about the diagnosis. It sounded, in some of these interviews, it sounded like he was just in denial, you know, when he would talk about it. Like, if the doctors are right, if the doctors know what they're talking about, you know, he said, I would rather just die in the ring. He's like, where would you rather die? At home in bed, in a hospital, or in the ring in front of 10,000 people having fun? And sure, I can kind of understand that logic, but that's pretty disrespectful of those 10,000 people who just watched someone die right in front of their eyes. You know, Ric Flair has said the same thing. He wants to die in the ring. It's sad. It's really sad. But the doctors told him he had 2 years or less to live. That was in November of 2016. He died in June of 2018. Just under 2 years from the time he got diagnosed. And at the time, he was in the hospital in a medically induced coma. It was his ex-wife who eventually made the call to pull the plug. She said they had an agreement that if anything ever happened, that's what they would do. And so she did it. And he was gone at 63 years old. One thing that always irritated me, though, is that after he got his diagnosis, Vader was very adamant about his desire to be inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. And whatever you may think of their Hall of Fame, it clearly meant something to him. And he was facing his own mortality, so I'm sure he was struggling with all of this stuff. But he had this great desire to be honored and be inducted. And clearly it meant something to him to have that one final acknowledgement. And it's not as if he wasn't going to go in eventually, right? We all knew he would. Mick Foley was very vocal about them putting Vader in the Hall of Fame, and they never did. Not until after he already passed away. He went in as part of the class of 2022. And Foley was very upset about that. But his body of work, Hall of Fame worthy to say the least. It speaks for itself. One of the great debuts of all time. Won championships and made big money everywhere he went. He was a huge draw everywhere, really except WWE. He was a huge draw everywhere else. When you think of great wrestling pairings, you think of Nick Bockwinkel and Bobby Heenan, you think of Undertaker and Paul Bearer, you think of Brock Lesnar and Paul Heyman. You can add Vader and Harley Race to that list. I wouldn't have them at the top, but I think they're definitely in the conversation. They're on that list. I've always said one of the great fantasy matchups that we never got to see, but if you take both these guys in their prime, it would have been incredible, is Big Van Vader against Brock Lesnar. What a battle that would have been. One of the best big men of all time who just did not take good enough care of himself. There was Leon White, and then there was Vader. And like his wife said, Leon just didn't really come back around until late in his life. He was just consumed for so long by being Vader. And maybe had he found that balance a lot earlier, things may have turned out differently for him.